Yeah.
That's right. Here's two more regular seats. There's one seat up front. There's a seat in the front row if anybody would like that one. A couple more chairs here. Okay. Would you like to sit? Sure, we have some more cushions. We'll see what we can find. Glad to have a nice turnout. Thank you all.
Hey, Bruce. Hi. Bruce Clement's back there. Okay. Do you know Bruce Clement? Did you ever meet him? No. He's a writer. And did you come to that event that we had for the literary event at UU?
I don't think I was here. I did.
You did, yeah, okay. But Bruce is one of the readers. Yeah, yeah. We're going to try to do another one on September 29.
Okay, this is the $15 cushion. Oh, very good. For you. Just because you walked all the way from Massachusetts.
Kathy, good to see you, Kathy. Kathy, there's a seat up front too, if you want. If you don't mind. That way you don't have to throw so far.
Okay, I think it's officially showtime. All right. So the tap dancing act will be first. Yeah. And then the fire
There's the tap dancer
eaters.
right there.
Oh, that's right. City College. Here's the City College. Yeah. And the revolving plates on the stick. We'll do that. Yeah, there are 3 bands, and then Bruce will read. Okay, so free to hear Bruce, but $75 for to hear the band. So, see Michael. So there are books, a lot of books. There might need to be some more sheets. I'll Xerox a few more. So Bruce Neuburger. I know from him bringing his book Lettuce Wars here to the store many years ago, dozen years ago.
Don't say so. Not that many.
No, okay. No, just yesterday. Just yesterday. I sold out my initial stock of 75 copies, and he had to come restock me yesterday. It's probably around here somewhere. Anyway, so a very important book that he's done here, and he'll tell you all you need to know about it. There's no point in me mangling anything except that it's a book. It's a heavy-duty book. And, yeah, available here. So Bruce Neuburger.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric.
You should have told me what it's called.
Okay, Postcards to Hitler. Okay. A German Jew's Defiance in a Time of Terror. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I really, really appreciate it. And I feel very honored to be speaking to all of you. And I'm very grateful to Eric and to this bookstore for inviting me here, for allowing me to be here. I've deepened my appreciation for Burton Beckett, just because so many people, when I told them I was going to be speaking here, their eyes lit up and they were saying, wow, that's a great place. So I know it's an extremely important asset to the community. And aside from, author events, they have a lot of music events and so on. Probably most of you know that already. So I'm going to try to limit my presentation. If I start getting too long-winded, somebody maybe, remind me or bring out a hook or something. But I do want to have I do want to do a limited presentation, and I want to have plenty of opportunity for Q&A, which I always find to be the most interesting part of these events. So anyway, That's sort of the way I'm looking at it right now. To start out with, the book is called Postcards to Hitler. A German Jew's Defiance in a Time of Terror, and it's about my grandfather. Okay, my grandfather Benno from Munich, and I sort of grew up to some certain degree with the story, although I had a very abbreviated, reduced version of the story from my father that I picked up, along the way. My whole family on my father's side came from Munich, and they came up in a time when Nazism was on the rise. Well, of course, they were there even before that, but they saw all that happen. And so my father would tell me stories like with he and his sister would be going to school when they're, like in the equivalent here of like a middle school. And they would see this guy walking his dog on the street with a trench coat, whatever. And it was Adolf Hitler, but it was Adolf Hitler in the early years before he really was a national and certainly not an international figure. So they had a very close-up view of how things changed over time in Munich, and so that was my introduction, sort of, to that. I didn't think a lot about it until like 1980. In the 1980s, maybe mid 1980s, and I was visiting my parents' home in Long Beach, California, and my father pulled out a stack of papers, and he said, "These are the letters that your grandparents wrote when they were in Munich." From the year, well, he didn't say the years, but it turns out the years 1938 to 1941. He gave me those. He said, "I think you should have these." And so I sort of stuck them away, I took care of them, but I stuck them away. I didn't really think too much about it. My father at that time told me, and had previously told me, that his father, Benno, had been murdered by the Nazis, and he had actually been put on trial and executed, okay? And the reason that he understood for that to have happened was that my grandfather had written an angry letter to Hitler denouncing the ill treatment of particularly himself and Jews, I think he said that. And that never really quite made much sense to me. Why would you do that? I mean, why would you write a letter to somebody who was murderous, and so that was the story that I lived with and that I understood to be what had happened until the early 1990s. Okay, and my father passed away in 1987. So when I was visiting my aunt, his sister, in the early 1990s, and she handed me a paper in German, and she said, "This is the transcript of the trial, or the summation of the trial, or whatever." And I took that paper and I had it translated into English from German, okay? And what that paper revealed was that my grandfather was not executed for writing a letter to Hitler. He was executed for writing a series of postcards, placing them anonymously in the mail, denouncing Hitler. And at that time, I didn't really grasp clearly all the different things that he had said. I've, in the meantime, read them very carefully and so on. But anyway, denouncing Hitler, and he got caught and was put on trial. Okay. So that was quite a different thing. I had never thought of my grandparents, my father or my grandparents, as activists. So it didn't quite register with me. Is this really true? This really happened? Okay. So that was what I understood at that point. And I would talk about this situation with other Holocaust survivors, people that I knew. Some of them were teachers and so on. And I'd say, my grandfather was put on trial in 1941 and executed. And they'd look at me and they go, "What? They didn't put Jews on trial. They put Jews on trial?" And I had the same reaction. Why would they have put him on trial? I mean, my understanding of that point of Nazism was, not real sophisticated. I understood that, it was the general story that Nazism, fascism was a violent dictatorship and anti-Semitic and all that stuff. But I didn't understand some of the nuances that would have allowed for that to happen. So I didn't understand it, nor did other people that I spoke with understand. And it took a long time, actually, to begin to understand why it would be that they would put my grandfather on trial in 1941 and execute him in 1942. Okay. The next sort of bump along the road here that sort of pushed me in the direction of both understanding the story and giving me some impetus to write about it was when my sister-in-law, Shirley, my wife, Sharon, and I were in Munich, and this was in the year 2000. And we went on a walking tour, a Third Reich walking tour around the city of Munich. And at a certain point, we were brought to a stone monument, and the guide said, "This is a monument to the White Rose." Okay, how many of you know about the White Rose? Have heard about the White Rose? Okay. I had heard about the White Rose. For those of you who don't know, the White Rose was a resistance movement of students from the Catholic University. It turns out in Munich. The thing that was shocking to me at that moment was that I knew about the White Rose. I deeply respected them for what they did. But I didn't know they were from Munich. I knew they were German. That was it. Now, all of a sudden, I'm confronted with the fact that the White Rose students were living in the same city as my grandfather. Okay, so I'm thinking, I didn't really believe that my grandfather was a resistor. Okay, at that point, I hadn't gotten to that point. But what I thought was, well, maybe then, and I knew the White Rose story. The White Rose story basically is these students at a certain point decided that they had to resist the Nazis. They learned enough about the horrific brutality of the regime and its constant lies and all the rest, and they decided they couldn't just sit and sit it out. They couldn't go along with it. So they began to put letters clandestinely in the mail. They would address the letters, but there was no return address, and they would send these letters through the mail to people denouncing the regime. And I also knew that it took a long time for the Gestapo to finally catch up with them. Okay, so my thinking at that moment when I was standing in front of this pillar was, well, maybe the Gestapo, they couldn't find who these folks were, so they picked up an old Jewish man, put him on trial, made big a deal about executing him as a warning to the students from the White Rose. Okay. That was my thinking at that point. Things developed further when some German historians and others began to write about my grandfather. There was one historian in particular that I think is worth mentioning. His name is Wolf Gruner, and he's the head of the Genocide Research Department at the University of Southern California. And he was very interested in not only, as there are many, and I have to say this with great respect and reverence, there are many German historians who've devoted their life, their work, to recalling what happened to Jewish people in Germany and writing about it and investigating and so on. This is a major part of, I think, why there has been some important awakening among the German people, because we've had people like that doing that kind of work. Wolf Gruner is one of those people, but he wasn't just talking about what happened to Jews and keeping that memory alive. He was convinced that the idea that Jews sort of went passively to their death and didn't really resist, he didn't believe that narrative, so he began to investigate. And probably around the time that my aunt had gotten a hold of this document from the People's Court, so-called People's Court, that was the German Nazi court. Somewhere around that time, he must have gotten a hold of those documents too, and he began to write about my grandfather. So I was able to through the internet. The internet's a wonderful thing for writers and historians, but I was able to find out about his writings about my grandfather, and I eventually got in touch with him. And it was over a period of time of discussions with him and other historians and doing more reading and research and so on, that I came to realize that actually my grandfather did carry out this resistance, that did carry out these acts of defiance against the regime. The other thing that I need to say here is that when I originally thought that that Benno had been picked up and executed as a warning to the White Rose, the dates didn't work out, because my grandfather began to resist. He began putting these postcards in the mail in September of 1941, and the White Rose really didn't start to become active doing their thing until April or so of 1942. So the dates didn't line up. Okay, so that didn't work. So anyway, that was it was every one of those little steps that I'm talking to you about right now were things that sort of pushed me along a path of eventually deciding that I wanted to write something. In the earlier stages of things, I wanted to get these letters, and I got the letters translated. A couple of a young German teacher here in San Francisco, I found him through Craigslist, and he and his father helped to translate the letters. The reason he brought his father into it is because the letters were written in an old German hand and he couldn't read them. But he sent them to his father. His father translated them from the older German hand to the more modern German hand, and then he translated them. So they did a lot of. I'm incredibly grateful to them for that what they did. So I had the letters, and I wanted just to sort of, maybe just print up the letters with an introduction and some other documents that I had from my father, and leave those as from my children, grandchildren, and great nieces and nephews and stuff like that. But then at a certain point, I decided in some of the factors were involved with other people encouraging me that this story about Benno should be told. Okay, so then I probably around 2017 or something like that, I seriously began to research and write this book. So that's sort of the general way in which this whole thing unfolded. In the meantime, there have been a number of other historians who I've gotten to know and have become good friends, who took up Benno's story and really considered it significant. One of them I'll mention is Bernard Dorner, who, by the way, and what I didn't mention was that I got a whole cache of documents from the Bundesarchive in Berlin. Okay. And this is another sort of, good fortune for me, because a lot of the documents of the Third Reich were destroyed by the Gestapo and other agencies of the government in those final days when it became clear that the regime was going to collapse. It just so happens that the People's Court documents were not, and they were all intact. So I was able to get a huge amount of documents, which included the interrogation of my grandfather. It included all the court documents and many, many other documents along the way as he was shuffled from one prison to another and so on. So that was, that was fortuitous for me, and made it possible for me to write the book. But I never got copies of the postcards. And so I got a copy of the printout of postcard number 1 says this and number 2 says that and so on, that was used in the court documents. So there was always this kind of lingering doubt in my mind that did he really do this or they just make this up? And anyway, and it wasn't until 2022 when I was in Munich for a memorial event for my grandparents that I was in the Marienplatz and we were getting ready to do a tour and stuff. Someone came up to me and he said, "Are you Bruce Neuburger?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I'm Bernward Dorner," and I'd heard about his name. And he said, "I have something for you." And so he handed me a thick folder of documents that he'd gotten from the Bundesarchiv. Some of it are things that I'd already had, but within that were the postcards. And if you look at the front cover of the book, 3 of those postcards were in that book that he gave me. So Bernward really took up the story of my grandfather in a major way. And one of the reasons why he was so intent on popularizing Benno's resistance was a postcard that was written in February, no, it was late January 1942, in which Benno said, "Death to Hitler, the murderer of 5 million." Okay. Now, he wrote that have you all heard of the Wannsee Conference? The Wannsee Conference was a conference held by the Nazis in the outskirts of Berlin in early 1942, where they laid out the plans for the final solution. Eichmann was there, and Heydrich was there, and Himmler, and these, the big shots were all there. And they laid out the plans. But that was, in January, and only like a week and a half or something like that later, Benno puts that postcard in the mail. So basically predicting that there was going to be millions of people murdered. Okay. Now, how would he have known that? And this is where Bernward really thought that this postcard was important, because he said it proves 2 things. It proves that those people who said they could not, they didn't know, and how could they know? It was only the small inner core of the Nazi party that knew about the final solution and so on. They said, well, but here was a Jewish man, relatively isolated at that point, as Jews were in Germany in that time, who had somehow figured it out, and that was one thing. People could have known, if they had kept their eyes open and wanted to know. And the other thing is that it proves that there was resistance, that the people were, Benno's acts were, proving that there was resistance among Jews and so on. In the meantime, well, I shouldn't say in the meantime, but Wolf Gruner came out with a book this year 2024, I think in January, called Resistors, if you're interested in that, where he went around and he went to the police stations and uncovered a lot of actions that you could equate with resistance of various kinds, but mostly on an individual level, right? That was what people were reduced to at that point. There wasn't really much possibility of organized resistance, particularly among Jews. So anyway, that's sort of the general story. Once I realized, or I decided I wanted to write this story, then I started doing some deeper research and also travel. So I traveled to some of the areas that I had heard about, where some of my family members were held or killed, which included Theresienstadt outside of Prague, Treblinka. You may have heard of that name. Treblinka is in Poland, 80 miles north of Warsaw. I went to a place called Kaunas, Lithuania, which I had not heard of before. I didn't know anything about it. But Kaunas, Lithuania, there's a place called the Ninth Fort, where the first train load of Jews to be deported in that final solution thing, which actually took place before the Wannsee Conference. But anyway, it was the first train load of what they call Reich Jews, German Jews, to be sent to their death. And it was sent from Munich. And a number of my relatives, these were nieces and nephews of my grandmother, Anna, were on that train and sent to Kaunas. supposedly were going to be sent to Riga to be resettled. And anyway, the train was stopped in Canada. Anyway, I'm getting all the details. But so I went around to these different places. I went to Munich again, where I met some historians there, one who's become a really close friend, Max Stranad, who's done remarkable work and great research on what was happening to Munich Jews. And Freibert Muldorfer, who did great research and devoted himself to keeping alive the memory of the family that are the in-laws, I guess you could say, of my grandmother in a place called Traunstein. So I just want to emphasize that these German historians, without their work, without their support, without their insight, I could not have written this book. It's just very straight up like that. Max Stranad did tremendous research on a place called Milbertshofen, which was a camp that was built outside of Munich, a holding center for Munich Jews before they were deported east, and other things besides that he's written. So anyway, all right. So that's sort of the outline of how I came to write this book and why I wrote it. I just want to talk a little bit about what I said in the leaflet, the flyer for this event, which is that they're talking about the arc of history, and specifically the arc that saw the move from Jews, this golden age. I don't know if people are familiar with this concept at all, but and I'm not sure that historians use that word that much, but the golden age of Jews in Germany, which roughly would be from the late 1800s, maybe even a little earlier than that, 1860s and so on, 1870s, to 1914. Okay, there's this period in which German Jews were doing quite well in Germany, relatively speaking. Okay, and it's important to understand that in relationship to what was going on in Europe at that time. Again, this is what I uncovered. And when I decided I wanted to write this book, and I did want to write Benno's story and Anna's story and the story of the other relatives of four families that are interrelated, and their story to some degree is told in the book, which is the Einsteins, which is my grandmother's family, the Neuburgers, my father, the Holzers, and the Spatzes. Okay, so the four families from four different places in Germany, four different cities. I wanted to tell that story, of course, as the heart of this book, but I wanted to put it in the context of what was happening in Germany and in the world really at that time, because for me it's important to understand not just the horrors, but how they happened. What is the antecedents? What are the social and political and economic forces at work that drive these things? Okay, so that was my interest. So in trying to understand all this history, I did as much as I could. I did reading and stuff like that, and so this era of relative prosperity and good fortune for Jews in Germany sort of began, you could say, in 1871, which happens to be, coincidentally, the year my grandfather was born. Okay, and 1871 also happens to be the year that the 23 German separate states came together as one German nation. Okay, and that particular thing came together. That particular thing happened through a war, which was the Franco-Prussian War, which I knew almost nothing about. I think maybe I'd heard that word, but I didn't know what it was really. So I went. Okay, so what happens is in Europe, and Europe is you all know, there's the Industrial Revolution. It becomes a relatively developed area of the world, relatively prosperous, becomes a colonizing part of the world. The colonizers. Okay, so starting out particularly with England and France, as their economies develop and they become more industrial and be able to develop manufacturing, including, of course, weapons, they're able to reach across the world and grab up resources and territories and so on. They became, colonizers, okay? Germany didn't really become a unified country in 1871, and by that time, a lot of the world had already been divided up. Particularly, England had the biggest share of it because of its navy, its sophisticated navy, and its military to back it all up. And France, sort of in second place, but also Belgium. You might recall the Belgian Congo and King Leopold and all that. The Dutch had their share. There was a bunch of European countries that had grabbed up sections of the world and divided it up among them. Germany comes along, becomes a united country in 1871, and its economy actually surpasses that of France and England and all the rest. Becomes the powerhouse of Europe, and so here's the problem. Germany becomes a major, what we would call an imperialist country, capitalistic imperialist country, at a time when the rest of the world's already divided up, and the Germans, and particularly those Germans who are, controlling the economy and politics and so on, are looking around the world and saying, well, where's our share? I mean, we're the big guys in Europe now. And particularly out 1871, when they defeated the French, okay, they became the dominant power on the continental Europe. And so there was a rise of German nationalism. Nationalism in general was very much in the air, all over the place. And it became very intense in Germany itself. Anyway, so there's a lot of national rivalry going on now between Germany and England and France. Germany is trying to grab sections of the world that the French, and particularly British and French and others, and the Russians too, had their areas of control. Anyway, and these other powers are just saying, no, you're not going to get any of that. So there was a rise of German nationalism, resentment within Germany because of that, and not just, it wasn't just a state of thought. It was also the German economy, like other economies, industrialized economies, needed raw materials, needed labor, needed markets. I mean, these are real things. You're not just inventions. These are real things. So there was a great deal of pressure on Germany also to, expand. So, there's a lot could be said about this, but I'll try to, reduce it down here. So what ends up happening is that what appeared to be a very prosperous, peaceful Europe explodes in war in 1914, when Germany, the spark for the war was the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand in Serbia, and he was murdered by Serbia in Sarajevo. Sorry, that was the spark, but the explosive material was all over. It was in these alliances that different countries had put together. Think about this as you look at the world today, by the way. Different countries coming together in alliance with other countries. So you had England, France, and Russia on the one side against Germany, Austria, Hungary, and in the beginning, Italy, but that changed during the war. And ultimately, the Ottoman Empire, too, was part of that. Anyway, so you had this explosive war, and Germany went into that war, and the German people went into that war with a great deal of both optimism and feeling of strength. Germany really felt that they had the ability to defeat the French and the British, and they had a plan to do so, and of course they failed. So the war dragged on for 4 years and became one of the most, a bloodthirsty horror show. Now, Jews, okay, they were opposition. There was opposition to the war, okay? It would be amiss for me not to mention the fact that there were socialist groups all over Europe that pledged that if a war broke out between these various countries, they understood that such a war would not be a progressive war. It would be a terribly destructive and criminal war. And they said so, okay? And they said, none of us are going to fight this war because these wars are going to pit workers from one country against the other for no benefit whatsoever for the working people. It's only going to be the benefit of the corporations and the wealthy and so on. And they declared in Basel, Switzerland in 1912, for example, a very strong, very forceful declaration that if a war breaks out, we're going to do everything we can to bring down our own governments because we're not going to fight this war. But what ended up happening was when the war actually broke out, there was a wave of chauvinism that sort of swept over all these countries, and it swept up these various socialist parties as well, and they became contributors to the war themselves. They became cheerleaders for the war themselves. So there really wasn't an opposition. There wasn't really a strong opposition to the war. So the only party of all these parties that had met in Basel and so on that actually stuck to their original principles was the Bolshevik Party in Russia. Okay, so anyway, so the war takes place, and it's a disaster for Europe. It's a disaster for the millions upon millions of people who died and others who suffered tremendously, and Germany lost the war. There's a lot that can be said about why that happened and so on. But by and large, Jews were part of that war in just as equal fashion as any other group within Germany. They were loyal Germans, and I think one thing I didn't quite mention is that during the period when Germany was industrializing, there was the growth of urban centers like Munich, like Berlin, like Frankfurt, and so on and so on. And Jews that had been largely scattered in smaller villages and towns, and in those circumstances suffered a great deal of discrimination and restrictions on what they could do in life. There were very strong restrictions on Jews, right? Even though the 1871 Constitution basically outlawed discrimination on the basis of religion. Nevertheless, that persisted. But what was possible for Jews then in that period of time was to leave these small villages, leave behind these social relations, which were very prejudicial and negative to them, and go to the big cities like Munich, like Berlin, and so on that I mentioned. And that was, in fact, what happened to my grandfather's family. They moved from a small town in Bavaria, where my great grandfather was like a peddler, but really no prospects in life except a life of poverty. Was able to move to Munich and actually make it into the middle class there. And that was true of a lot of Germans. They became loyal to Germany because of that, and they became very secularized too. Their religion changed. They became what they call Reformed Jews, and so anyway, so German Jews become very German. Way is described, and I think I described in the book. They changed from being Jews who lived in Germany to Germans who had Jewish roots. There was a psychological change that took place. So German Jews were very much part of the war. They were as much a part of the war percentage of their population as any other Germans were. But as the war dragged on and losses began to mount, and a certain amount of restiveness was taking place within Germany because of that, the German military conducted a census in which all the various Jewish soldiers had to justify what they were doing in the war. They were required to fill out a form that described what they did. And what the German military command was trying to do was to prove that, well, Jews may be part of this war, but really they're shirkers. They're not really doing. But the census was never really popularized because that was not what they found. They found that Jews were just as much on the front lines as any other members of the community. So anyway, but you can imagine how Jewish soldiers might have felt. This was in 1916, by the way. Here they are in the war. They're seeing their friends, their relatives, and so on die in battle or get injured in just the same degree as anybody else, and then they're being selected out for this kind of discriminatory treatment. So, the war ends. When the war ends, I won't go into detail about this, but Germany loses. Okay, Germany loses. At the same time, there's the Bolshevik Revolution. Things in Europe are getting very complicated. And when Germany loses the war in 1918, sort of in that late summer of 1918, it becomes very obvious that Germany cannot continue. There are a lot of factors that Germany had the advantage in a short war, but not in a long war, because imagine England has this vast empire to draw from. Germany did not have many colonies, and they did not have a powerful navy in any case to be able to draw resources from those colonies. So in the long run, the British and the French, who also had a lot of colonies, so had the advantage over Germany. Germany ends up losing the war, and especially because the U.S. started to get involved in it too. That's another factor. So anyway, Germany loses the war. In the wake of this final offensive that the Germans carry out, what happens is that the sailors in the North Sea rebel, refuse orders to mobilize. They rebel. They basically mutiny. They take over their ships. They march off their ships. They go to the factories. The factory workers join them. They start marching around Germany with red flags. They had been influenced by the Bolsheviks, by the way. The Bolshevik Revolution had taken place the year before, and the sort of fever of rebellion and revolution was sort of in the air at that point, especially given the horrible consequences of the war. So all of a sudden, the German military finds itself in the midst of a rebellion and potential revolution, and so what ends up happening is that the military command, and there's one person in particular here that is mentioned in the book, and I think you never hear this guy mentioned when they talk about fascism and Nazism and stuff. Very important person. His name is Erich Ludendorff. I probably, has anybody ever heard of this guy, Erich Ludendorff? Okay, great. Okay, so people have done their research here. Erich Ludendorff was one of along with Hindenburg, were the two main commanders of the German military. Okay, and Ludendorff comes up with this very clever strategy. When it becomes clear that Germany's going to lose, he turns power over to the Social Democrats so that they'll have the onus. They'll have the onus of having to surrender to the, and this becomes a very important factor later on as Nazism begins to rise, and there's a lot of agitation and propaganda against the Weimar Republic, which was what is born out of this revolution, right? The Weimar Republic. So Ludendorff comes up with a strategy to give power to the Social Democrats, but the Social Democrats by this point were, in terms of, whose origin was in a more radical period of a more revolutionary party and so on, had completely lost that character, and they were now a party of the establishment. Okay, and they were happy to do their part to save the old German system, and that's what they did. So there was a revolution, but the revolution came up against a very powerful counter-revolution. Now, here's where we get into Munich in particular, because the revolution hit Munich, and there was a particular day for this in November 8, 1918. It was a big rally in Munich, of this big area that nowadays they have the Oktoberfest at. But anyway, there was a huge rally. There were hundreds of thousands of people. There were two separate groupings. One was the sort of the establishment Social Democrats, and then there were the more left faction on the Social Democrats called an Independent Social Democrat. Anyway, one of them was led by this guy named Kurt Eisner, and this is a really important personality in this whole saga of how things went about it, changed in Germany, because Kurt Eisner, he really wasn't a hard-edged political person, but he was in fact he was a poet, and he was a writer and so on. But he happened to be at a certain point in time. He happened to be there. He led this one march, which actually ended up seizing power in the city of Munich. Okay, it ended up seizing power in the city of Munich, and my grandfather and my parents, obviously, they're caught in the middle of all this. They're seeing all this stuff go on, right? This tremendous turmoil that's happening. and it goes from being a period of real depression and suffering during the war to all of a sudden there's a revolution and it really was, and I get this from Victor Klemper, who was there. He was a Victor Klemper. Some of you may know who he was. He was somebody who wrote a diary for later during the Nazi era, but he was there. He was a professor. He wrote a book called Munich in 1919. Anyway, it was an outpouring of great enthusiasm and optimism and the potential of a revolution to change things. But fairly quickly, that revolution was crushed. And there was a group called the Freikorps. I hope I'm not getting too much detail here. By the way, is it getting hard to follow?
Learning a lot.
No? Okay, so the military organized these counter-revolutionary soldiers to crush the revolution. Okay, that's the essence of it. And Eisner led this rebellion of people to take power, and without a shot being fired, nobody was hurt, nobody was killed. Okay, because the soldiers at that point, in November 1918, they were so fed up with everything, they just joined in mass. And so the powers that be in Munich told the Wittelsbach, or the monarchy, they said, the military is going over to the revolution, so I don't know if we got anybody to protect you, So the Wittelsbach decided, we better leave town, okay? And they were going to leave town in their car, but then they found out that their driver had become the revolutionary as well. So they had to rent a car. They rented a car and drove to Switzerland, but they felt, eventually we'll go back. But they never were able to go back. Anyway, okay. So what happens is that the revolution takes power in Munich. It's a very confusing and difficult situation, but really important to understand is that those who led the revolution from Berlin, quote unquote revolution in Berlin, were very conservative, and they didn't uproot any of the old bureaucracy, any of the old judges, any of the old military people. They all remained in power. So they were able to mobilize using that apparatus against the revolution. And they I should say that Eisner was assassinated in January of 1919, okay? And there's a scene in the book right about the huge funeral. I mean, there was a great outpouring of love for this guy, even among people who didn't really support him politically, kind of liked the guy, like his moxie, that he stood up against the war and he was brave and so on, just to honor that. So there was this huge, funeral, but and then after he dies, there's a series of other little more radical Bavarian governments that come, but they don't last. And then the Freikorps move in on May 1st, 1919, and slaughter people. 30,000 soldiers, organized by the military and by the Social Democrats. They come in and they slaughter people. And this is a very crucial moment because Munich prior to that had been somewhat of a bohemian city. I mean, there was a lot of cultural life there, especially before the war, and so on. And but the counter-revolution comes in. They massacre people. Other people are forced to flee. The more progressive, the people who had identified with the revolution in any way, they either had to hide out or they had to leave the country or they were killed or put in prison or whatever. And so Munich becomes, by the summer of 1919, kind of the hotbed of right-wing agitation. Okay. So when people talk about and people think about Hitler, they think about and Nazism. They think, well, Hitler came to Munich and he was such an incredible orator. He was able to win people over to his side. Well, it really wasn't Hitler creating this reaction in Munich. It was the reaction that brought Hitler out. It gave him a base to work from. Okay, and Hitler was a very good orator. And he was able to forge a program. And one key part of this program, it's really important to know, is that going back to this Erich Ludendorff, who was the head of the military and was facing a potential revolutionary overthrow, and who came up with this idea of the Social Democrats taking power, he also came up with another clever idea. He got his military people together and he said, you know what? I want you to go out there and tell people we didn't really lose this war. We were stabbed in the back. We could have won this war. But at a key moment, people stabbed us in the back by opposing the war and opposing Germany. And you know who those people were? Jews. Okay. So he began this whole thing, and that became that was like, we see how the right-wing media here, promotes certain ideas over and over and over again and wins people to those ideas, wins a base of support for those ideas, whether or not those ideas correspond to reality or not. And in Germany, the stab in the back, big lie, became the rallying cry for what became the fascist movement. Out of that, Hitler forged his particular version of the right wing, which was the Nazi Party. Okay, so my parents, my grandparents are living within, and I tried to describe that as best I could. How would they have thought of this? How would they have seen this? How would they have grappled with all these changes that are going on? All of a sudden, loyal Germans. My grandfather bought war bonds during the war, went broke when the war bonds were not worth anything after the war when Germany lost. All of a sudden, they are being told, the Jewish population is being told, you're the ones that betrayed us. They're talking about Eisner and some of the other people around Eisner who were Jewish, happened to be Jewish, but just happened to be born Jewish. They weren't Jewish in any other fundamental sense. They weren't really religious people. But because they were Jewish, they were identified as the enemy, as, and all kinds of conspiracy things that, were unfolded around that. So I tried to imagine then and put together in the book how the family would be reacting to that. How would they understand that? How would they react? How would they do? And so on. And so that's a lot of the book right there. But I just want to mention one more thing and then open it up to questions and comments and so on. That is, Nazism was not just anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic and militarist and all the other things that you know about, but they had a certain brand of anti-Semitism, which you could call racial anti-Semitism. Now, there was anti-Jewish stuff goes back in Europe many, many years, back into the Middle Ages and so on, but anti-Jewish ideas and movements generally were more cultural, religious, and that sort of thing, And Jews are not, they're not Christians, and, all these things about, Jews murdered Jesus, and, that kind of stuff, okay? But that was sort of the traditional anti-Jewish stuff. But that was not Nazism. Nazism didn't care about that. Nazism was very clear. Jews were an inferior foreign race that had got into Germany and was bringing Germany, not only was it doing bad things like trying to take over Germany through these revolutions and stuff, but it was also poisoning, to use Donald Trump's term, poisoning German blood. Okay, but where did that come from? And this was one of the things that I really wanted to understand, and did a lot of reading and stuff. Where did this racial idea? And I wrote a chapter which was called How Hate Became Racial, and I ended up taking that chapter out of the book because it didn't quite fit. But I tried to interweave some of those ideas in other ways. But I wrote a separate essay which I put on Counterpunch if you want to read it. It's also on my website. But anyway, so I try to do an examination of that issue of how, and one of the things, the conclusions I came to, is that racism is very, very, well, this is not going to surprise anybody here. Racism was very, very much a central ideological factor of colonialism. And you think about it, when the British and the French and the Belgians, think about King Leopold and so, and the Germans, when they went around the world, taking over people's countries and doing all those nasty things to them, they had to justify it to themselves and to their own populations. And of course, race was the way they did that. Now, that was European peoples versus non-European peoples. And of course, that continues to this day, all right? Very, very much so. But how did this business of Jews being a race come about? And there's a story there. I'm going to trace it all for you right now, but there is a story there of how sort of this racism towards non-European peoples ends up being utilized, that same idea, in relation between different, European peoples. Okay, and Jews in particular became the target of this kind of racism. So this is something that other people had put out there. And another factor, which again important here, is that Germany did have some colonies, and one of them was in Southwest Africa. Okay, and there's a book called The Kaiser's Holocaust, which talks about how 80% of the Herero Nama people of Southwest Africa were wiped out by the Germans, and their short, maybe 20 years or whatever, they dominated that region. They lost the colony in World War I. The British took it over. But in those years that Germany dominated that colony, it was extremely brutal. And the ideas that were used to justify this atrocious massacre and enslavement of the Southwest African people, those ideas migrated into the motherland, into Germany, and became part of the mix. Okay, so then in the course of things, actually, there's a lot of references to Jews and Africans, more than you would think. Okay, that actually come out, and there's some of the stuff. I won't give it all away now, but there are some things in which in the book it comes out. But and to this day, while the German government or the German leadership or whatever you want to call them, while they readily admit to the horrors that Hitler brought to Germany and the world, and they're very open about it was terrible and we never want to go back there and so on. They very rarely talk about Southwest Africa, and they don't like to talk about Southwest Africa. They don't like to talk about what they did to the Africans. And part of the reason, I think, my view of it is, they don't really want to talk about colonialism. They don't want to talk about, because this is really basic to this whole system. Colonialism and colonial oppression and colonial domination, is a central feature of European capitalism, okay? And it's why European capitalism became so wealthy and why the United States became so wealthy, including, of course, slavery and genocide here, of course. But this is the factor of this society and this kind of society we live in that really they don't want to talk a lot about. And so even Germany, I was reading recently, they don't, they discourage people from talking about what happened in Southwest Africa and stuff. Some of the veterans, and I'll close with this, some of the veterans from Southwest Africa, which Germany loses in World War I, and so the like I said, the British, and I think there's the South African part of the British Empire took it over. Some of the veterans of those wars against the Herero and Nama people end up in Munich. Some of them are leaders of the Freikorps, which I mentioned before, these counter-revolutionary troops that invaded. They became leaders. Von Epps is one of the names that's out there. Another one was Hermann Göring. You may have heard of him. His father, Heinrich, was an administrator in Southwest Africa. So the ideas, there's not just the ideas from Southwest Africa, from that colonization, but also individual people end up in Munich and become part of this fascist movement. They bring those racist ideas into that movement. And you may have heard of a guy by the name of Ernest Röhm, who was a military guy who became a right-hand man for Adolf Hitler. And when the Nazis are organizing their own militias, okay, you probably heard of the brown shirts, right? Okay. Well, the brown shirts comes from the fact that the old uniforms of the German army in Southwest Africa, the old uniforms were brown uniforms, and when that whole business collapsed, there were a lot of leftover uniforms that went into army surplus stores. Literally, this is what happened. And Rome and his people went looking for uniforms for their new militia, and they bought up these brown shirts. And that's how the name brown shirts came to be. So there's a very direct connection, kind of. So anyway, that's I think, there's probably, there's more things that could be said, but I think I'm going to leave it there, and we'll see if you. There were a few things that I wrote in the. Has anybody heard the Joe Louis Max Schmeling fight in 1938? Okay, you all heard of that? Okay, yeah, it's one of my favorite parts of the book. But anyway, and it actually happened. Well, not to fight. Obviously, the fight obviously happened, but the scene that is described in the book, and the reason I know it happened is because someone who lived in the same apartment building with my grandparents wrote my father a letter in 1948, and he writes to my father, he says, "You remember in June of 1938, before you left Germany, that we stayed up to 3 a.m. listening to the Max Schmeling Joe Louis fight? Do you remember that?" This is another side of the story, because little tidbits like that, is one thing I failed to mention is every little scrap of information that I could get from interviews that I did, letters, archive material, blah, 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 and so on, and other historians, every bit I tried to put together to try to fashion a picture. I describe it as like trying to put together a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle with 100 pieces. And try to form a So that's Anyway, Marty.
So Bruce, this segues into a question I've had, and that is, you didn't write a history book; you wrote a historical novel, and you make great use of imaginary dialogues between people. So, and it's very effective in this story. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about writing dialogue and imagining what people said or how people felt, and how you did that as a writer, not as a historian.
You're asking about what drugs I was on when I wrote? Is that? No, actually writing dialogues is really fun. Okay, and I had never written many dialogues before. A little bit, in Lettuce Wars there's a little bit of it, but those were dialogues that I had been a part of, so it was a little bit different. These I had to imagine. I did find it fun to invent people and give them certain parts to play. It's like putting together a theater. But I always told myself, or I justified this to myself by saying, of course, I couldn't have known what people were saying to each other, obviously, right? So if I was going to present what was happening from their point of view, I'd have to invent a lot of it. But I did try to hone as closely as I could to what I understood was the history, the actual history. So when there's all these beer hall scenes, right? There are all these beer hall scenes where people are talking, and for example, there's this guy named Arnulf who's a social democrat, okay, and I read a lot about the social democrats and some of the internal struggle that was going on there, and some of the conflicts that were there was a lot of conflict and tension between the Bavarians and the Prussians, for example, and some of it was because the Prussians were really trying to monopolize the power. And the Bavarians were part of Germany, and they were trying to, so I tried to, take what I had learned from history, and all of us, when we sit down and McKinney back there, when we have our beer, we sit and talk about politics. We talk about all kinds of things, right? Everybody, when they get together, they talk about all these kinds of things, right? So it's not unnatural, right? I mean, it's not like you can't talk about Donald Trump because we're having. So I just tried to put, how would people be relating to these events that are coming down on them? How would they react to them from their different points of view? And I knew, for example, Rolf is one of the more reactionary guys in this group, and I knew that there was resentment against Jews that in oftentimes was sort of covered over with sort of friendliness and beer drinking buddy kind of relationships, but also sometimes emerged out of things. My father had told me, my father was a shoe salesman, a traveling shoe salesman. Okay, he traveled from the time he was 15 to the time he left for the United States, where he was like 29. All those years he traveled around Germany, visiting all these cities. He really knew Germany pretty well, and he knew Germans pretty well. And he told me, I got along well with everybody until 1933, and then things started to change. So what happens politically in a country, and we all know this, right? What happens politically in a country, reflects itself in people's ideology and people's outlook and understanding. So my father would say, I would meet these people that I had gotten along with, and all of a sudden they're, not so friendly anymore. Or all of a sudden they're coming out with ideas that were very uncomfortable for me to listen to, even people who had sort of more progressive, he said, ideas started mouthing some of these nationalistic, racial ideas and stuff like that. So I tried to take that knowledge that my father gave me and tried to reflect on how would that come out of different people's mouths, right? And then how would other people react to them when they're saying that? So that's what if for anybody here who likes to writing dialogue, I think is really fun. It's I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot. Yeah.
How old was your father when his father died, was executed?
So my father was born in 1908, so he would have been 33 when his father died. No, 34. But his father died. Of course, his father died in Berlin. My father was already here. My father was living in New York at the time, and making a desperate effort to get the family out, which is another side story to all this. But yeah, go ahead. Yeah, John.
Bruce, thanks a lot for writing this book and this excellent presentation. And I'm really interested in how tragedy and guilt affects families. You mentioned your grandfather was writing your father's family to say, hey, things are really bad. What can you do to get me out? And it wasn't successful, in large part to the terrible policies of this country when it comes to refugees and immigrants. Do you think your father had a lot of underlying guilt that he was unable to get them out of Germany?
Underlying guilt. I know there was a lot of frustration involved in that, and in terms of when I went through, just to go back a second, when I went through the letters that once they were translated, at first I couldn't figure out, I couldn't make out the difference between one and another, because they are all, almost all the letters would say things like, "I hope you're doing well. We're doing fine." Even as things got worse and worse, they would try to do it. But if you look closely at them, you could begin to see some, increasing desperation. And particularly after 1938, Kristallnacht in November 1938, when my grandfather was put in Dachau. And my grandmother writes to my father and his sister, "Your father's away right now, but I expect him back any time." And of course, my father and his sister, and at that point, no, he wasn't married. So anyway, they're reading about these massive anti-Jewish riots and, synagogues burning and so on. So they're just going crazy, But my grandmother saying, "We're doing okay. Your father should be home anytime now," that sort of thing. We just saw, I just saw Willie, which is her brother-in-law. Willie lived in another town. I think my father would have understood at that point that not only was his father probably in a camp, but he would have understood that the family, the Holzer family, that was kicked out of their he would have understood it. I think he would have understood that. So at that point, I mean, they were. My father came in late July 1938. This happens in November 38. They were desperately trying to get the family out, and here's a part of the story that I only uncovered, or it wasn't me that uncovered it, but anyway, I only came to understand fairly late in this process, and that is that the U.S. and you referred to this, John, the U.S. Did everything it could, frankly, to keep German Jews and other Jews as well from being able to immigrate here, and they couldn't do it legally, but they did it sort of clandestinely, or if that's the right word. There was a memo that was written by Beckett Long, who was the Assistant Secretary of State, to the consulates in Germany, telling them to throw every obstacle they can imagine in the path of those seeking to get out. Now, of course, the United States knew that people were desperate. They couldn't say, "Oh, we really didn't know," because there was the desperation was obvious. People were going to these consulates and trying to get their visas. And my grandfather in particular, was just incredibly frustrated because, and he couldn't understand why they were making no progress. And anyway, so.
So did your father have survivor's guilt in this case, or did he I know I'm asking you to interpret another person's inner thoughts. Do you think he had survivor's guilt, or do you think he had tried everything he could?
I think he tried. I think he knew he tried everything he could. In fact, at one point, they purchased visas for Cuba, and at first my grandfather said, "No, why would we go to Cuba? I mean, we're older people. We don't know the language. What would we do there?" And so on and so on. But then, as things were unfolding, they were ready to go to Cuba. But my father, and he was married by that time, put out what would have been the equivalent of 6 months of wages to buy a visa for his mother and father, and the money disappeared in some bureaucrat's pocket, and they never, And my father told me that story too, So it was like $800 or something like that he paid for a visa, Yeah.
So, Bruce, you did a great job of tracking the progression of fascism in Germany in all its many stages. So, how does that compare to the situation in the United States now? Do you see a large progression of fascism now? Are you worried about what may come in the election?
Absolutely. Yes, I am.
How do you compare the current situation in relationship to Germany? Like, what stage, or does fascism take different forms in different countries, obviously? But
kind of difficult to compare, but I would say in terms of, there might be the question of why does fascism even become a movement? Where does it come from? And in Germany, I think it's pretty clear that the loss of World War I sort of stultified the German economy. And the powers that be were looking for a way to break out of that stultification, the Versailles Treaty and all these other things. And Hitler came along with a program which wasn't satisfactory to all the elite. I mean, it probably was, somewhat crazy to them, but in certain aspects of it. But Hitler was successful in bringing together a mass movement to make Germany great again, which meant Germany winning the next round. So they gave him their support. Here in the United States, I mean, I think the U.S. has come from being the number one power in the world, of course, unrivaled practically after World War I, to now becoming embroiled in more and more competition with other powers, Russia, China, the Europeans, and so on. The U.S. is not as dominant as it once was, and can look down the road and see, trouble ahead, and it's not as uniform. There's all these things that have happened with civil rights movement, all the things, the women's movement, and all that, have changed the character of this country, and made it more difficult for the powers that be to keep everything under control. I think that's the way they look at it, and fascism is a way of reasserting that domination and that control. In a world that's becoming increasingly tense and contentious. So I think in those are the two parallels, and so how to compare the stages of things here and there, it's very difficult. I mean, I was thinking about the Weimar Republic and their reaction to the rise of Nazism. And I had a dialogue here that, if you're interested, I could read you a little bit of, where there's a Sabbath dinner, and someone who, his name is Herman Spatz, he was a veteran of the World War I, is talking about, have you heard of the movie or the book, All Quiet on the Western Front? Okay, so that book came out around 1930, or the book, no, it came before that, but came out in the 1920s. But the movie, All Quiet on the Western Front, which was produced by Carl Laemmle, and Carl Laemmle actually plays a role in this book, was very popular in Berlin, and it did not portray the German soldier as these great heroes that always win. It portrayed the German soldier as young men who were frightened and undergoing terrible problems in the trenches, and we're not, all that sort of thing. So it was not a pro-war movie. The Nazis hated that movie. And so when it shows up in Berlin in 1930, Goebbels organizes groups of people to go into the theater, throw stink bombs, and do all this kind of stuff. But here's the thing, and Herman Spatz is at this table, and he says, I want to talk about this. He says, nowadays, if you go into a bar or a club and you say, Germany didn't really lose the war, he says, people will pat you on the back and buy you a drink. But if you say Germany lost the war because the soldiers were fed up with it all and the people were suffering and blah, 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 you're lucky to get out in one piece. He says the way he puts it in here, the idiots have taken over the conversation, and only the idiots have the right to speak. I mean, you kind of see some of that here, where the right to tell the truth is becoming increasingly difficult. If you want to tell the truth, to get your truth out there, it's harder and harder, to some degree. And I think so. There's a parallel too. There's these lies that are being promoted in order to keep the system intact and so on. And so the Weimar Republic shut down that movie. Okay, a commission of the Weimar Republic shut down that movie. Okay, rather than confront the fascists and say, no, you're not going to do this, because they still had police, they still had, they had some power. They shut down the movie, wouldn't let people see it, because they said it provokes violence. So I don't know if there's any particular modern equivalent to that here, maybe people think of, but
Well, the Christian nationalism.
yeah, Christian.
Banning books.
There you go.
Different states.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, and is, huh?
10 Commandments.
And the Ten Commandments and all that kind of stuff. But is the I was thinking about this in terms of January 6th, and to the extent to which the quote unquote Weimar Republic of our day, which would be more like the Democratic Party, I guess, to the extent to which they are actually prosecuting the people that took place in January, the people that carried out January 6th. In Germany, when Hitler tried to overrun Munich in 1924 with a Bierhauptputsch, he was treated like a hero in the courts and given a slap on the wrist, and none of the putschists were really punished. Okay, so I'm not sure that the parallel is exactly the same. I mean, so I think there is more resistance within the establishment, the liberal establishment, to fascism here, but not what it needs to be and what it should be. And people get tired of me saying this, but we need my opinion, we need a mass movement. We need a movement from below, and we can't rely on the elite or a section of the what you might call the capitalist imperialist system to protect us from fascism. We have to protect ourselves from fascism and not be stymied or limited by what the Democratic Party or those people in power try to do. And they don't, and they really don't want to see a mass movement. Democrats don't want to see a mass movement. It becomes dangerous.
They're part of it.
Yeah, right. So Richard and then Bruce.
I'm just wondering, Germany is, in relationship to the size and the structure of the U.S., is much smaller.
Right.
And I'm wondering, because the divisions here appear to be almost localized, California or whatever, against Idaho.
Right.
And so it's not like the country is doing something. It's like parts of the country are at odds with other parts.
Yeah.
And because of this way we have of electing people who lose the popular vote can win the election
Right.
several times.
Right.
So is that going to be? Do you think that's an issue here? I mean, I'm looking at another secession crisis, quite honestly.
Wow. You mean like California seceding from the Union kind of thing?
Along with Oregon, Washington, New York, Rhode Island.
Well, my daughter who lives in the Midwest said, "Oh, thanks a lot. You're going to leave us to the fascists. I get it." But anyway, no, I don't know. I mean, what you're saying about sectionality is true, but I have no idea how this is going to play out. People won't get their Social Security. Yeah, it's hard for me to imagine that happening, frankly. But whatever, it's not gonna be nice and neat and clean and calm and collected. It's going to be something quite dramatic. But Bruce, you had your hand up.
Just a couple of points. I think that one of the powers of fascism is its idealism. I was doing a book set in Nazi Germany some years ago and met a Nazi who said to me, when Hitler was in power, I could look a banker in the eye.
Uh-huh.
So there is that strong egalitarian, we're as good as the elite, and we're going to show them that that's true. And I also met women who belonged to the Nazi Girl Scouts and who kept alumni meetings going. I mean, they continued to meet after the war. They were called the Bund Deutsche Mädchen, which is the girls' club. So Hitler Youth, which was men, could not have alumni meetings, but the girls' clubs did, and their social service element. So one of them said to me, "We're better than your Girl Scouts because your Girl Scouts play and we serve."
Okay.
And then the third point, when my mother-in-law was arrested in 1944 in Nazi Germany and was interrogated, her tactic, which was brilliant, was to say to everybody who was asking questions or doing something to her, she would say, if Adolf Hitler knew what you were doing to me, he would have your job. So, I mean, it goes to the
I hear what you're
point
saying.
of separating the leader from everybody else.
Yeah.
That the idealistic element in fascism, which I think is very strong, then separates its leader from the ordinary consequences of misbehavior and turns them into somebody who is above morality and who would wreak vengeance on you
Right.
if only he knew what you were doing to me.
Well, that's interesting, Bruce. I think that you know the Nazi Party is the official name is the National Socialist German Workers' Party, right? And Hitler specifically was very concerned to keep both the national and the socialist in the name. I mean, there were people within that party in the especially early days, that said, why are we? Where's the socialist thing coming from? And Hitler was very clear about that. That there was a robust socialist movement in Germany. Social Democrats, by the way, were the largest party. There had been a very powerful revolutionary socialist communist movement in Germany. So the socialism and communism had a broad appeal among German workers, particularly in the earlier days when the exploitation of the industrial workers in Germany was very raw. And later, as time went on, and Germany became somewhat more prosperous, they were able to grant some concessions to the workers, which kind of ameliorated that to some degree. Okay, but Hitler knew that he was competing with socialism, so he put that in the name. The nationalism was put in there to assure the powers that be that he was on their side, and so he so and when the purge took place in 1934, when Ernest Röhm was assassinated along with a lot of other people, one of the reasons for that purge in 1934 was that, and Röhm was the head of the SA, or the brown shirts, right? So he had a powerful position. One of the reasons for that is because some of those guys actually believed that Nazism was going to be for the working class. They believed the rhetoric, but it was just rhetoric. It was a party for the German imperialist bourgeoisie, right? That was what the party was for. It was for their interest, for their benefit, for their empire, and blah blah blah. But it was populist, and so we see the same thing here with Trump, right? I mean, you appeal to the people based on I'm going to stand up for the little guy, but of course you use racial divisions and extreme patriarchy to maintain the real control by the elite. That ideology, the ideology of racism and the ideology of patriarchy, divides people against each other and weakens people. And weakens a mass movement. It weakens a real progressive movement, right? So anyway, I mean, Hitler understood that, and as long as you were within the program, the nationalist program, the Nazi program for Germany and so on, they could say they could give you all kinds of like goodies, I guess, which does that make sense to you, or does that sound like it? Is that true, do you think, or Bruce? You think that anyway? So that's the way I see that.
And it's not accidental that Volkswagen means people's company.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. Right. The Volk, the Volk, and yeah,
The courts were Volksgericht.
yeah, the Völkischer Beobachter, which was the German, the Nazi paper, the people's voice, basically, is what it is. The people's voice. It was very much that populism was very much a part of Nazism, and it's one of the reasons why it was successful. And Hitler understood that. He studied these things. If you read some of the biographies of Hitler, he was very astute in understanding and studying mass movements and how they played out and how they, yeah. Dolores?
Yeah, I lived in Germany too, and the 80s. And they said Hitler gave them wonderful jobs. They started building the Autobahns, and they did this, and I was just astounded that they would say stuff like that. But that he had some very good programs for children, and probably of course just pure Germans. But they still, even after all that, and they were leftists, and they said he had a good program for the people. But purity came into it, and good things, and a lot of people fell for it.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
When in 1960, my mother and brother and sister were in Germany, and we were living in a pension. And the son of the lady who ran it was a newspaper man, and he had been a captain in the Panzer Division during the war. And he and my mother got into huge arguments. I've never heard my mother argue as much as she did then. But because he flat out refused to believe that 6 million Jews died. And he hated Americans except for black soldiers. Those are the only ones he liked. Because he had been a POW. And the POW camp that he was in was run by black soldiers. Not initially, but became a group of black soldiers, and they treated him better, he said, than the white soldiers had.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
It's a very
But
interesting story.
It was very interesting how that denial
Yeah.
stayed,
Yeah. There's a book, if you're interested in by Susan Neiman called Learning from the Germans. Did you read that one? Yeah. It's a very, very good book. And what I learned from that book was that, the coming to terms with Nazism took a long time in Germany. The first several generations after the war, there was a lot of denial. There was a lot of denial, and a lot of them, she would say things like, well, a lot of the Germans thought that they had suffered more than anybody else because they lost the war and so on, It really wasn't until the 1960s and the youth rebellion, which, of course, we had here as well as in Germany, where the young people were confronting their parents and saying, what about that history? What about what happened? And it forced the question out in the open. And now, of course, these later generations of Germans are very open about what Germany did, and very much interested in that all the youth. I was in Munich in 2018 as part of this investigation business, and I was in and I got visited by a guy by the name of Eckhart, who's a relative of my great nephew back there, sort of a relative by marriage, and he worked for the German government, and I was talking to him, and a really nice guy, I really liked him, but he said something to me that really stuck to me. One thing is I said, look, I'm here investigating to write a book, and I said I'm wondering, does the world really need another Holocaust book? And he said yes. He said, yes, we have to keep reminding ourselves and our younger generation of what happened, because there are people out there, he implied at least, that would like us to forget, And of course, the right was already not as strong as it is now, but it was already beginning to move. And he said something else that I thought was very interesting. He said, he was part of the government. He said, Angela Merkel government. He said that we opened up Germany to 1 million Syrian refugees, not only just out of humanitarian reasons, but for political reasons, because we had to combat the chauvinism of the right wing, by showing that I was very impressed with that, So anyway, that was
There's a good movie out,
yeah.
June Zero, if anybody have seen her.
I haven't. June 0. Okay.
Extraordinary.
It's where's it playing?
It was at the Opera Plaza.
Oh, really?
It's about the execution that, it's a little bit in depth about Eichmann.
Oh, really? Okay.
Absolutely intense.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, if anybody's
Yeah. Thank you.
interested in seeing something phenomenal. There's
Okay.
several great movies out.
Thank you.
Just to those who are interested.
Okay. So I'm Linda, who hasn't. Did you?
Totally different.
Oh, okay.
It's part of it. I knew very little about the White Rose except that they were non-Jews who were, you know, recognizing and trying to do something about what was happening. And to find out that they used a very similar method to what your grandfather did. I wonder if they had any way of knowing what he had done, if that trial was publicized, and if there were other people who had taken up that method of protesting.
Okay. That's thank you for that question, Linda. Yeah, there's okay. So that was a question that I had, of course, all along, and for those who don't really know that much about the White Rose, that was Sophie and Hans Scholl were sort of, along with some other students in that university, the Ludwig Maximilian Ludwig University. It was a Catholic university. Yeah, they organized sort of an underground group to put, as I mentioned before, they were executed. They were caught and executed. It's a very interesting story if you want to. But anyway, years later, Inga, their older sister, or maybe I think it was an older sister, yeah, wrote that Hans and his friends in the university and Sophie, I guess, we're seeing from time to time, we're seeing little articles in the newspaper, in the Munich newspapers, announcing the execution of people who had stood up to the regime. Okay. Individuals who had denounced the regime. Okay. And it was from that, they drew inspiration from that. They basically said, well, there's other people that are standing up. What about us? We should stand up too, you know? So it was very courageous on their part, you know? And now, what I speculated on in the in the epilogue to the book, because when my grandfather was executed, there was such an article that came out in the paper, and it's in the book. And in addition to that, the Ministry of Justice printed up big, bright red posters, which is what they did often with these cases, and had them put up around Munich announcing the execution. Of course, this was done to intimidate the population, right? Now, did the White Rose folks see that? Did it affect them in any way? Now, the White Rose began to do their work in April of 1942. My grandfather was executed in September, so it wasn't in the beginning, but they kept doing their stuff until February when they were caught, in 1943. So it's very possible, because it was Munich, right? It's very possible that they heard about it, and it's possible that it influenced them. But that's all you can say about it, you know.
Did you have any contact with any relatives of the White Rose?
I did. Okay, there was a guy by the name of George Wittenstein who survived the war, and he was a member of the White Rose. He ended up living in Santa Barbara, and by happenstance, there was a project of interviews with Holocaust survivors and so on. And I was working at an adult school, and I had a video class, and so somebody came to me and says, "Can you make copies of this video?" Okay, so I had George Wittenstein's video, and he was, you know, talking about all this stuff that happened, and I wrote to him and I said, "Did you ever hear of a guy by the name of Benno Neuburger?" And he wrote back and said, "No, I didn't." Which is very understandable. So I did try to trace that, but I don't think at this point there's any way of tracing the influence. You know, for those of you who are interested in this subject and want to know more about the White Rose, it is really interesting. It's a very uplifting and heroic story of the White Rose youth. They are incredible, in my opinion. what they did. In fact, right around the time of Stalingrad, when it, see, because look, part of the reason, and going back to what I had was thinking about before, why did they put a Jewish man on trial? Okay, the best I can figure is this: Germany invades the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. Their plan and Hitler's anticipation is they're going to overrun the main Moscow and Leningrad, quickly. They're going to subdue this within months because they had done that in France. Okay, they were going to do that, and then they underestimated the Soviets, but and also their own racism plays into this because they're a Slavic people. They can't stand up to the Aryan Superman and so on. But what happens is that the German army gets bogged down on the approaches to Moscow and Leningrad, and then is forced to endure a very harsh, bitter winter in Russia, in the Soviet Union, Russia, and the German high command and they're starting to panic. Okay, and they're realizing, because they wanted to carry out this war without having to impose too much on the German public. Because going back to World War I, the German public suffered a great deal during that war. And that was part of the reason that the morale of the military and the civilian population went to hell. So the Nazis wanted to prevent that from happening. But they realized by the winter of 41-42 that wasn't going to happen, that they were going to have to squeeze the German people to be able to produce the goods necessary to keep that war going. And so they were already listening for signs of discontent. And so when they decided to put Benno on trial, it was precisely because, in my opinion, because they were trying to forestall, trying to intimidate the population. And
also start to verbalize actively and out loud that it was the Jewish people that were making the problem.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
reiterate that.
Right. Actually, it's interesting you say that, because there is a certain point in that era and that time when there's a memo comes out from like the Goebbels group, the propaganda saying, we need to intensify the hatred of the Jews as part of our war, of keeping the morale of our population up. And here's another point that's important. My grandfather put his first postcard in the mail on September 20th, 1941. Does anybody know what the significance of that date is? Okay, the significance is that was the first day the Jews had to wear the yellow star. Okay. So here they want to identify the Jews. Okay, they want to identify the Jews as a way of intensifying the pressure on them, but also, they had done all this propaganda against the Jews, and some people are saying, well, wait a minute, the Jews aren't dying like our kids are in the front lines. You know what I mean? So they had to intensify that. I think that was part of the thing. It was intensifying that, But anyway, I think that was intensifying the oppression of Jews was very much part of this kind of like creating this beastly attitude among the population. That we're going to do everything. We'll murder anybody and everybody, and we're going to that kind of thing. It was, yeah, you had a question?
Yeah, what was your grandfather actually accused of?
He was actually accused of putting. The charge was high treason.
Oh, okay.
High treason. Yeah, that was the highest possible. That was the worst possible offense you could be charged with.
Yeah. And death was always the penalty, right?
Death was, especially at that time, and especially for a Jewish person. The Nazi People's Court was notorious for the large number of death sentences that they didn't sentence everybody to death for everything, but and especially as time went on and difficulties for the German military mounted, more and more quote unquote crimes were added to the capital punishment category. Yeah, and in 1944 when they tried to assassinate Hitler, the conspirators, they were all brought before the People's Court, and they were all.
Coming up in about a week, isn't it?
What's that?
July 20th.
Oh, July. Oh, you mean when my grandfather? Yeah.
No, I mean, the
Oh, is that the date?
assassination that failed.
Oh, the failed assassination. Okay. Okay. What's it? Oh, okay. All right. I think we're going to have to wrap it up now.
Are you gonna sell books or what?
No. No. Come on. No. Yeah, of course. Anybody? Eric? How much time do we have? To.
When you're all ready to clear out, we'll be done.
Okay.
I may leave before you.
Oh.
Lock the door on your way out.
Yeah. There you go.
Long walk to go home.
Yeah, we should start wrapping it.
Okay, so we're going to wrap it up now. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for your questions and everything. Those of you who want to write it, if those of you who want to buy a book, I will be happy to sign it, but we're going to have to do it quickly. So, okay. Oh, I don't have.
You want cash?
It's for you. No.
No, take them and send us. You don't
Some of the
take
time.
card?
Some of the time. No, I don't take cards.
Hi, how are you? Well, how much are they a piece?
Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you. No, I did not know you. Dolores, I did not know you.
Yeah.